Case File 9, Species, Human, Initial Assessment, Tier 4, High Emotional Volatility, Final Assessment, Withheld. The archive teaches that every catastrophe begins as a correctly filed report no one was willing to read. I have repeated that line to junior officers so many times that they think I invented it. I did not. I earned it. There is a difference, and the difference cost 400 families the sleep of a single night they never knew was in danger, and it cost me something I have not yet finished paying. I am Corin of the Velari Directorate, 40 years in the fleet, and I am going to tell you about the worst decision I ever made, which was not a decision at all. It was the absence of one. It was a small habit of certainty, practiced daily, until the day it nearly killed people I had sworn to protect. I judged a human by her species, and her file, and the color of the tier stamped beside her name. I was wrong, in a way that does not forgive itself. And the strangest part, the part I still turn over in the dark of my quarters, is that she never once told me I was wrong. She simply kept me alive while I insisted on it. This is the story of the day the galaxy learned that the quietest voice in the room had been the only one telling the truth. Let me begin where the certainty began. The Vale Aran was a command vessel of the old build, all long corridors and hard light, and I had commanded her for 11 years by the time this story opens. She was mine the way a hand is yours. I did not think about her. I simply moved, and she answered. My crew numbered 411. My record was without blemish. I want you to understand that I say this not with pride now, but with a kind of horror, because a record without blemish is not the same thing as a record without error. It only means the errors have not yet been counted. The Directorate ran on a document called Directive 17 say. You may know it by its common name, Species Reliability Indexing. It was a system for sorting every non-Velari we encountered into tiers, so that a commander in the middle of a negotiation or a crisis would know, at a glance, how much weight to place on a given voice in the room. Tier 1 species were partners. Tier 2 were reliable, Tier 3 required supervision, and Tier 4 was the tier for volatility, for the emotional, for the ones the Directorate had decided could not be trusted to hold steady under pressure. Humans were Tier 4, every one of them by species, before a single word was exchanged. I did not write the directive. I want to be honest even about my defenses, because they were real, and because they are the most dangerous part of this story. I did not invent the tiers. I inherited them, the way I inherited my rank and my ship and my certainty, and I used them the way I had been trained to use them, which is to say I used them to know, in advance, whose judgment I did not have to weigh. I kept a private instrument for this. Every commander kept notes, but I kept a personal reliability assessment log, my own record, in my own hand, of every officer and envoy and liaison I dealt with, updated after every exchange. It was, I believed, the mark of a rigorous mind. A senior officer in a rigid service comes to treat his protocols the way a tired man treats a chair, not as a tool that still requires him to sit correctly, but as permission to stop holding himself up. The log was my chair. I sat in it for years. It held. The log had never been wrong. That, I would learn, was only because I had never let it be. Her name was Voss, Lieutenant Voss, Cultural Liaison Officer, assigned to the Vale Aran by the joint compact that governed mixed species commands. I remember the day she reported aboard because I remember thinking so little of it, a human, small by the standards of my people, dark-haired, with the flat, unreadable calm that my briefings had taught me to interpret as suppressed instability. Tier 4 species, my notes told me, often mask their volatility behind stillness. When I looked at Voss and saw a person who did not fidget, who did not raise her voice, who met my gaze and held it without heat, I did not see composure. I saw a warning light. That is what the tier had done to my eyes. It had turned her steadiness into a symptom. They gave her an alcove off the main corridor, a narrow workspace with a folding console and a single hard chair, on the spinward passage between my quarters and the command deck. I walked past it every shift, twice, sometimes more. I mention this because it will matter later in a way I could not have imagined then. At the time, it was simply a fact of the ship's geometry, that the human small station sat on the exact path I could not avoid. Her light was always on. She worked long hours. I noted this in my log as diligence, or anxiety, monitor, and moved on, and did not stop. The Silari Combine had requested talks. The Combine were a trading power on our coreward border, Tier 2, courteous, precise, and we had done business with them for a generation without incident. The talks concerned transit rights through a contested band of systems, routine on its surface, the kind of negotiation I had conducted 100 times. Voss was assigned to advise me on cultural handling. I regarded this as a formality. I had negotiated with the Silari before she was born. The night before the first session, she requested a briefing. I gave her a quarter of an hour. She spoke in short, exact sentences about Silari honorific structures and the way their courtesy shifted register to signal position, and I listened with the particular patience one reserves for information one has already decided is beneath use. She did not plead her case. She did not press. She simply laid the observation down between us like a coin on a table and left it there for me to take or ignore. When she rose to go, she paused at the hatch. She said only one word before the doors opened. Careful, and I filed it, without thinking, under nothing at all. The chamber the Silari chose for the first session was warm and low-lit, hung with the woven banners they used to mark neutral ground. Envoy Tesh received us with every courtesy his people possessed, and his people possessed a great many. He was tall for a Silari, his skin the pale gray of river stone, his voice a thing of nested politeness that folded meaning inside meaning the way their diplomats were trained to. I found him agreeable. I have since learned to distrust that particular pleasure, the pleasure of being flattered by someone whose profession is flattery. Voss sat at my left, one place down and one place back, as protocol placed her. Through the first hour she said nothing. She watched Tesh the way a surgeon watches a wound, and I mistook her attention for the nerves of a Tier 4 officer out of her depth. It was late in that first hour that she leaned toward me, barely, and spoke under her breath. She had noticed something in the way Tesh phrased his opening terms, a discrepancy, she called it, between the transit language he used aloud and the transit language written into the draft annex before us. In Velari, the two read the same. In the Silari tongue, she said, they did not. She asked me to hold, to let her verify the annex before I signaled agreement to the day's framework. I did not hold. I want to be precise about why, because the reason is the whole of my failure, and I will not soften it. I did not weigh her observation and reject it. I did not test it against Tesh's face or the text on the table. I reached instead for the thing that let me stop thinking. She was Tier 4. The tier existed precisely so that a commander need not slow his own momentum for the anxieties of a volatile species. Her caution was, by definition, the noise the directive had prepared me to expect. I told her, quietly and not unkindly, that Silari courtesy often unsettled newcomers, that I had done this many times, and that she should observe and learn. Then I turned back to Tesh and signaled that his framework was acceptable, and I felt the small, clean satisfaction of a man moving efficiently through familiar work. So I marked her assessment closed, tier confirmed, and did not notice that my crest had flared the moment I overruled her. The first session ended in what I took for success. Tesh saw us off with a courtesy so elaborate it bordered on affection, and I returned to the Vale Aran satisfied that the talks were proceeding as talks with the Silari always had. Voss walked one pace behind me down the boarding ramp, silent, her hands folded, and I did not ask her what she had seen. I had already decided that whatever she had seen was Tier 4 seeing, which is to say a distortion of the true picture, and the true picture was mine. But she had said one thing in the chamber that snagged in me, and I could not entirely shake it loose. She had told me that Tesh changed how he named me. In the first hour, she said, he had addressed me by the honorific the Silari reserved for equals in trade, a warm word, a word between partners. In the second hour, after I signaled agreement to his framework, he had shifted to a different honorific, 1/2 a degree cooler, the word their tongue used for a party who has accepted terms and is now, in some sense, held to them. To my ear, both words were courtesy. To her ear, one was courtesy and the other was a lock closing. I did not write it down. She did. I know this because it was in her log later, timed and dated, the exact hour of the shift noted in her small, precise hand, while I sat beside her hearing nothing at all. The envoy changed how he named me between the first hour and the second, and only one of us wrote it down. The second session convened 2 days later, and it was there that the pattern of my failure set hard, the way a joint sets crooked if it is not corrected early. Tesh had come to the matter of the transit corridors themselves, which systems, which lanes, which of the contested bands would fall under joint administration, and on whose authority. It was intricate work, and I was good at it, and I enjoyed it, and my enjoyment was part of the trap, because a man who is enjoying his own competence is a man who has stopped watching for the thing his competence cannot see. Midway through, Voss touched the edge of the table between us, a small signal we had agreed meant hold. I held, grudgingly. She said, low, that Tesh had just used a conditional construction, a phrasing that in Velari read as a simple statement of intent, but in Silari carried a buried condition, a clause that would only activate under circumstances he had not named aloud. She asked me to require him to restate the term in plain declarative form before I accepted it. I looked at Tesh. Tesh looked back at me with the mild, open patience of a partner waiting for his colleague to finish a private word. And I made the calculation I had made 100 times, which was not a calculation at all, but a reflex dressed as one. To halt the envoy, to demand he restate a term of courtesy in blunt declarative language, would be to insult him, to signal that I did not trust his phrasing. And why would I risk insulting a Tier 2 partner on the say-so of a Tier 4 officer whose entire species the directive had flagged for reading threat into shadow? I told her the phrasing meant nothing. I told her that Silari conditional constructions were a feature of their courtesy, and that a newcomer often mistook their politeness for cunning. I told her to observe, and as the words left me I felt, again, that small tightening at the base of my skull, the sensation my people call the flare, the involuntary rise of the crest filaments that runs through us when we are under strain and will not admit it. I did not connect the two things. I did not think, my body is telling me I am afraid of what she sees. I thought only that the chamber was warm. I told her the shift meant nothing. My filaments told the truth before I did. That evening she came to my quarters unbidden, which was itself a breach of the deference the tiers were meant to enforce, and she brought her notes. Not spoken this time, written, compiled, laid out in a document she had prepared on her own hours in that narrow alcove off the corridor. She set it on my table. She said, in the same even voice she used for everything, that she believed the Silari were constructing a treaty whose Velari text and Silari text would not say the same thing, and that the divergence was not accidental, and that if I signed the final instrument as drafted I would be signing two different agreements at once, only one of which I had read. I read 3 pages. I want you to know that I read 3 pages, because for the rest of my life I will have to hold the fact that I read 3 pages of the truth and then stopped. What I did next, I did with my own hand. The directorate log system required a disposition on any officer submission, a category, a routing, a place in the record. I could have marked it under review. I could have marked it escalate. I marked it instead with the category the directive provided for input from Tier 4 sources that a commander had assessed and set aside. The category was low reliability observational, non-actionable. In the crew's own shorthand, in the shorthand I myself had used for years in the wardroom with the easy contempt of men who have never been wrong, we called that category Tier 4 noise. I stamped the file myself. Tier 4 noise. I can still see my own hand doing it. The third session was the treaty annex, and the annex is where the teeth were. Tesh presented the near-final instrument with great ceremony. It was a long document, and its length was itself a weapon, because a man reading a long document in a warm room across from a courteous partner reads for the shape of the thing and trusts the fine grain to the drafters. I read for the shape. The shape was good. Transit rights secured, our colonies protected, the contested band placed under a joint administration weighted, I believed, in our favor. Voss read the fine grain. She did not have the standing to read it aloud in the chamber, so she read it in her seat, one place down and one place back, and I watched her stillness deepen the way water stills before it freezes. There was a clause deep in the annex, a dependent clause hung off a paragraph about liability for shipping losses in the joint band. In Velari, it assigned liability jointly, shared, fair. In Silari, she would show me later, character by character, it did not. In Silari, the clause transferred all liability for any loss in the band to the party administering the relevant lane, and the drafting placed the busiest and most dangerous lanes under our administration. We would carry every loss, they would carry none, and the losses in that band, over a decade, would be ruinous. The claws read cleanly in our tongue. It was the other tongue that had teeth. There was a moment near the end of that third session that I did not understand until much later, and understanding it is one of the small private agonies I have set aside a portion of my remaining years to sit with. The Silari sealed each session with a shared cup, a ceremonial vessel passed between the principal parties, drunk from in a fixed order that their protocol prescribed to the smallest gesture. I knew the protocol. I had performed it many times. The cup came to me and I lifted it to my right and drank and passed it on precisely as the form required, and I felt the quiet competence of a man performing a ritual correctly. But the order of the cup, Voss told me afterward, had changed. In every prior dealing, the Silari had passed the cup first to the party whose terms were being honored, a gesture of respect to the one receiving the benefit of the agreement. This time Tesh had directed the cup to come first to himself, and then to me. To my eyes it was a trivial reordering, a courtesy rearranged. To Voss it was the Silari telling the room, in the only language that could not be denied later, who they understood to be the beneficiary of this treaty. Not us, them. They were toasting their own advantage in front of me, in a code I had been too certain to learn, and I drank to it, and I smiled. I lifted the cup to my right, the way the protocol taught me, and did not see her stop breathing. I have not yet told you what the treaty was actually for, because I did not know it myself until the thing was nearly done. The transit corridors, the liability clause, the joint administration, these were the visible body of the agreement. But there was a purpose beneath the purpose, and Voss found it before anyone, because she was the only one in my command reading the Silari text as a text and not as a translation. Deep in the schedules appended to the annex was a list of the lanes we would be assumed to administer, and among them, unremarked, was the approach lane to the Thren Band. The Thren Band held a single Velari colony, an old agricultural settlement, 400 families, farmers and their children, on a world too poor to rate a garrison. The liability structure Voss had uncovered did more than cost us money. Under its terms, if any Silari vessel suffered a loss in the Thren approach, a loss the Silari themselves could engineer at a time of their choosing, we would be liable, and the liability instrument gave the Combine the right to seize administrative control of the lane in compensation, which meant the colony, which meant the world. They were not buying transit, they were buying a doorway to a place where 400 families slept, and they were having me sign the doorway open with my own certainty for a pen. Somewhere past the Thren line, 400 families slept under a sky I was about to sign away. The signing was set for the 4th session. I want to tell you that I saw it in time. I did not. What saved us was not my sight. It was Voss, working inside the one narrow seam of authority the tears had left her, doing the quiet, unglamorous thing that liaison officers do, and that no one ever quotes in the after-action reviews. She did not stand and denounce the treaty. She had no standing to do so, and had she tried, the tear beside her name would have let me dismiss it as exactly the volatility the directive predicted. She did something smaller and far harder. Under the compact that governed liaison officers, she held a technical authority over the certified translation of any instrument the command signed, a clerical power, a stamp, the kind of things senior officers never think about. She could not stop me from signing, but she could decline to certify the Silari language text as a true and equivalent copy of the Velari, and without her certification the instrument could not be executed as a bilingual treaty. It would have to be redrawn, retranslated, resubmitted, delayed by days. So on the morning of the signing she filed, through proper channels, a formal notice that the translation required review before certification. She cited a procedural technicality, dry and unimpeachable, buried in the compact's own language. She did not tell me the treaty was a trap. She told me, in a routine memorandum, that a translation certification was pending and that the signing would need to be postponed to the following cycle. She made it a paperwork delay. She made it boring. She made it mine to sign off on as a matter of good order, and she let me believe the caution was my own. She did not raise her voice. She simply made it impossible for me to sign the wrong line and let me believe it was my idea. The delay held, and in the days it bought, the thing came apart the way traps come apart when they are given time. A directorate translator, working the mandatory certification review, found the liability divergence and raised it through the technical chain, and the technical chain raised it to me, and I convened an emergency session and confronted Tesh with the two texts side by side, and Tesh, being Silari, expressed the most exquisite regret at the drafting error, and withdrew the clause with a courtesy that fooled no one who now knew what to look for. The treaty was renegotiated, the Thren colony kept its sky, 400 families went on sleeping and never knew. I told myself, in those days, that the system had worked, the translator had caught it, the certification review had done its job, good order had protected us, exactly as it was designed to. And I noted in my log that Lieutenant Voss's translation delay had been procedurally irregular but not materially harmful, a mild rebuke, a note that she had held up a signing on a technicality, that she had overstepped the quiet lane a liaison officer was meant to keep to. I filed it and thought no more of it. One last time, at the very end, I read her caution as her flaw. It was 3 cycles later, alone in my quarters in the dead middle of the ship's night, that I finally opened the full log she had built. Not the 3 pages I had read, not the excerpt, but the entire private record she had kept, from the first session to the last, every observation dated, every honorific shift timed, the cup order, the conditional constructions, the liability clause traced character by character, the Thren approach circled in her own hand 3 days before I understood what it was. I read it from the first page to the last, with the lamp low and the ship silent around me, and somewhere in the middle of it my crest filaments rose and would not settle, and this time I knew exactly why. Every page was dated, every page was right, and every page had been in my hands the whole time. I sat with her log open until the ship's night gave way to the pale artificial dawn the veil Aaron kept to mark the shifts, and in those hours the shape of what had happened turned over inside me, and showed me its underside, and the underside was worse than the crime I had thought I was confessing to. I had believed when I opened the log that I was about to read the record of a near miss, of a danger I had walked us toward and been pulled back from by good order and a diligent translator. That is the story I had told myself for 3 cycles, and it was a comfortable story, because in it the system worked and I was merely one of its many working parts. But the log did not tell that story. The log told a different one, in Voss's small, exact hand, and it named a truth I had spent the whole negotiation refusing to write down. The translator had not caught the trap in time. The translator had caught it only because there was time to catch it, and there was time to catch it only because Voss had bought that time, alone, from inside an authority so minor I had never once considered it a source of power. The certification delay I had rebuked her for was the entire reason the colony still had its sky. She had not overstepped her lane. She had used it, precisely, at the one moment it could be used, to stop me from doing the thing I was determined to do, and she had disguised her rescue as a clerical inconvenience so that I could accept it without ever having to accept that I needed rescuing. The system had not protected me from the Silari. Voss had protected me from the Silari, and then she had protected my certainty from the knowledge that she had done it, because she understood, better than I understood myself, that a commander who cannot bear to be saved cannot be saved loudly. I had spent 3 sessions certain that the human at my left was the emotional liability the directive had warned me to manage. And all 3 sessions she had been the one managing me, quietly, without credit, without a single raised voice, keeping her volatile senior officer from walking his whole command into a doorway held open for the taking. I had not been protecting my command from her. She had been protecting it from me. There is a recording I have not been able to delete, and I do not intend to try. Among the files appended to Voss's log was a voice memorandum, a debrief she had recorded for herself after the 3rd session, in the alcove off the corridor, the narrow station I had walked past twice a shift for a year and never entered. The ship's log placed the recording's origin there, in that little room I could not avoid and had never chosen to see. I played it in the dark of my quarters, and her voice came out of the console exactly as it had sounded across the negotiating table, flat, even, unhurried, entirely without heat. She was not angry, in the recording. That is the thing that undid me. She had every cause for anger, and there was none in her voice. She simply walked through what she had observed hour by hour, and what she believed it meant, and what she intended to do about it within the authority she held, and where she expected to be overruled, and how she planned to work around being overruled without ever forcing a confrontation her tear would let me win. She had mapped my failure in advance. She had planned her rescue around the certainty that I would not listen, and she had spoken of it not with bitterness, but with the plain patience of a professional describing the terrain she had been given to work. At the end of the memorandum, she said, for no one but herself, that the families in the Thren band were the whole of the matter, and that everything else, the honorifics, the cup, her own standing, the commander's regard, was whether to be worked through on the way to keeping them safe. I listened to it 3 times, and on the 3rd time I reached for the stylus. The directorate keeps its assessment logs in permanent record, and a permanent record can be appended, but the original entries cannot be deleted, only struck through and corrected. The old certainty left visible beneath the line drawn through it, so that the correction and the error stand together forever. I had spent 40 years adding to my log, and I had never once struck a line. That night I opened it to the first of my entries on Lieutenant Voss. Tier 4, composure likely masking instability, monitor, and I looked at it for a long time, and my hand, which does not shake, shook. So I took up the stylus, and for the first time in 40 years of service, I began to write down what had actually happened. The directorate convened a formal inquiry into the Silari negotiation, as the directorate must whenever a treaty of that weight is renegotiated under duress, and I was called to give account before the review board. This is the part of my confession that the archive keeps, because it was recorded, and because it is the part I would most have wished to keep private, which is precisely why I have chosen to make it the part I tell first when I tell this story to the young officers who think I invented my own aphorism. The board did not know when I entered the chamber what I intended to say. They expected the account a commander gives in such rooms, a measured narrative in which the system worked. The danger was identified through proper channels, and the commander's judgment, though tested, held. It is the account I had every incentive to give. My record was without blemish. Voss's rescue had been quiet enough that I could have taken the credit, or given it to the translator, or given it to good order, and no one in that room would have known to contradict me. She would not have contradicted me. That was the whole of her method. She would have let me have the story, the way she had let me have the delay. I did not give that account. I asked the board's leave to read into the record certain entries from my own personal reliability assessment log, in my own hand, dated during the negotiation. And then, in front of the assembled review board of the Velari Directorate, I read my own words aloud. I read the entry where I marked her first warning closed and tier confirmed. I read the entry where I stamped her compiled findings low reliability, observational, non-actionable. I read the rebuke I had filed for her translation delay, the delay that had saved the colony, in which I had called her caution procedurally irregular. I read each one in the flat voice I had learned, too late, from her, and I did not soften them, and I did not explain them, and when I had finished reading I let the silence sit in the chamber the way she used to let her observations sit on the table between us. Then I told the board the thing I had come to say. I told them that the divergence in the Silari text had been identified, correctly and in full, 3 sessions before the translator found it. I told them it had been identified by Lieutenant Voss, and set before me in writing, and that I had declined to act on it. And when the presiding officer asked me, carefully, giving me the exit any of them would have taken, how such a clear and material observation had failed to reach the command's attention in time, I did not take the exit. I had the correct observation in my hand. I filed it under Tier 4 noise because the protocol told me that was where it belonged. They cleared me in the end of misconduct. There had been no malice, no negligence the directive itself did not sanction, and that was rather the point I had been trying to make, though I do not know how much of it landed. What they did with Directive 17C and the cycles that followed is a matter for other case files and other confessions, and the changes were smaller than I had hoped and slower than they should have been, because institutions strike their old certainties through even more reluctantly than the men who serve them. But a review was opened. The word tier, spoken in a wardroom, began to carry a faint weight it had not carried before. It was not much. It was more than nothing. I have learned to sit with the difference. Voss was commended. I saw to that, through the proper channels, with the full weight of a commander's recommendation behind it, and I was careful to write the commendation in terms that named exactly what she had done. Not courage, not heroics, none of the loud words the citations usually reach for, but the quiet, unbroken professional competence of an officer who had done her work correctly under a superior who would not let her, and had kept 400 people alive by refusing to make her rescue a battle she knew she would lose. She received the commendation with the same even calm she received everything. She did not thank me for it. I did not expect her to. I have come to believe she understood, better than I did even then, that the commendation was not for her. It was mine to write, the way the failure had been mine to write, and the writing of it was the beginning of my learning to see. Long after, I received a transmission I had arranged to have forwarded to me, though it was no business of mine to monitor it, a routine cultural report out of the Thren band, the kind of dry administrative note that crosses a commander's desk by the hundred. It noted the completion of the harvest on the old agricultural world, and the founding of a new school in the principal settlement, and the enrollment of some 60 children in its first term. There was an image appended, the way such reports append images, of the children on the school's first day, small and squinting in the pale field light of a world too poor to rate a garrison, on a morning under a sky that was still theirs. I looked at it for a long while. Then I did the thing I have made a practice of doing, in the quiet of my quarters, in the years since. I sat with my log open before me. I turned to my old entries on Lieutenant Voss, the certainties I had written in the confident hand of a man who knew whose judgment he did not have to weigh, and I read them once more the way I make myself read them, without flinching. And as I read, I noticed, the way she had taught me to notice, too late to spare her the cost of teaching me, that the flare had not come. The filaments at the base of my skull, which had risen every time I overruled her, and which I had been too certain to feel, lay flat and dark and still. The filaments stayed dark and still, the way they should have been all along, and one by one I crossed my old certainties out. That is the case file. I have told it to you as plainly as I know how, because the plainness is the only honor I have left to offer, and because I have come to believe that the observation you are least willing to hear is almost always the one already sitting, correctly filed, in your own hand. So I will leave you with the question I have learned to ask myself, and I will ask you to sit with it the way she taught me to sit with silence. Whose warning are you filing under noise right now, today, because the label on them tells you that is where it belongs? Tell me in the comments. I read them, and I have learned, finally, to read the quiet ones first. If this case file moved you, mark it, follow the archive, and stay for the next one. The archive never forgets, neither should you.